wonder, have you ever made a mistake only to realize that your mistake actually made your situation better? Have you ever made a mistake only to discover that your mistake made the situation better? Believe it or not, there are a number of famous examples where this exact thing happened. For example, in the development of the tea bag. Mr. Sullivan, who was sending a bunch of tea leaves to a potential client, didn't really know how to send it, so for convenience he put the tea leaves in this little silk pouch. And when his client received them, he was a bit confused, didn't really know what to do, and so he started dunking his silk pouch into hot water, and boom, the tea bag was invented. Similar thing is true with the case of the invention of cornflakes. Brothers John and Keith Kellogg accidentally allowed a batch of cooked wheat to go stale, but they decided to process it anyway, and it resulted in this little thin flake which ultimately made them millions and millions in the future. And that really is a story of the Bible, isn't it? That's the story of the world. That men make many mistakes, they fall into many sins, they follow their evil desires, but little do they know that all of them, although they're following their own agendas, ultimately play into God's hand, and God's ultimate agenda for His glory will be fulfilled in our world. And that's true of 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 28 through to 53. Here we have a passage which shows us God's sovereignty and God's faithfulness to His people. You might remember what's been happening in 1 Kings chapter 1 so far. King David is on the throne, but he's on his deathbed. His son, King Solomon, is the one who's due to take his place on the throne, but one of his other sons who we were introduced to yesterday, Adonijah, is a bit of a character and he's on a bit of a power trip. And Adonijah tries to steal the throne off his brother Solomon. He gets all the chariots and the priests in to have this inaugurating ceremony to force himself onto the throne. But you might remember at the end of yesterday's passage that the prophet Nathan and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, had great concerns as they found out this was happening, and so they went straight to David. And that's where we break into our passage for today. In verses 28 to 30, you see that David is greatly disturbed by this, and so he sets into motion and affirms that Solomon is to be the next king. And so he rushes this ceremony to inaugurate Solomon as the next king. He makes it happen straight away. And so this ceremony takes place. Solomon is throned as king. And as you can see, there's great celebration. In fact, as you look to verse 40, you'll see that there's so much celebration that the earth actually begins to shake. But what about Adonijah? Surely he is furious. Well, we're told how Adonijah finds out in verse 50. Jonathan is a guy we're introduced to. He's a messenger. He goes to Adonijah and he tells him what has happened. Your half-brother Solomon, in spite of your greatest attempts to steal the throne from him, has now already become king. And what is his response? Well, he is filled with fear. This is terrible news for Adonijah. His half-brother Solomon is now the king. That's the same guy who he tried to betray. Now his half-brother Solomon has all the power, all the authority. He could have Adonijah taken out and put to death just like that. And so you'll see what Adonijah does. You can see in verse 50 we're told that he goes to the sacred tent and grabs the horns of the altar. It's a bit of a strange picture, but it literally is a symbolic way of Adonijah confessing his sin and pleading for mercy. But thankfully for Adonijah, King Solomon is a more gracious man and a nicer man than he is, and he does show him mercy. And he says, you can receive mercy, but you're on your last warning. No more mischief. And so what do we learn from a passage like this? Well, there are many things that we can learn, but one thing is God's faithfulness in spite of human sins. It appears that God had promised King David that his son Solomon would be the next king. But as you started reading 1 Kings chapter 1, it appeared that God's promises were under threat. Is God really going to be true to his promise? When people like Adonijah, when sinful men were doing their own thing and trying to upset God's plans? Well, what we learn in 1 Kings chapter 1 is that God's plans and God's promises can never be upset. No amount of human rebellion can thwart God's plans and God's promises. In fact, the author of Proverbs said it well in chapter 16 verse 9. He says, in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Even today, humans are constantly, like Adonijah, trying to fulfill their own agendas and follow their evil desires. Yet they never succeed. God's agenda for our world will always be met. No human wicked plan can ever thwart God's plans or somehow hinder his promises. God's promises will always be met. That's true in the case of King Solomon, but it's especially true in the case of King Jesus. Because King Jesus, like King Solomon, was promised to us by God. King Jesus, like King Solomon, ultimately almost had his coronation hindered due to a number of evil and power-hungry men, not Adonijah, but King Herod and the Pharisees. Yet King Jesus, unlike King Solomon, was able to restore and redeem his people, as he was sent by God to be salvation for his people.